In a divided world, confidence gets celebrated, but self-awareness is what sustains true leadership. And the truth is, most leaders are never taught how to develop it. Welcome to the Learn It All podcast, the show for today's leaders who want to get ahead and stay ahead, because we believe great leaders aren't born or made, they are always in the making. I'm your host, Damon Lemby, two-time best-selling author and CEO of Learn It, a live learning platform that has helped upskill over 2 million people over the past 3 decades. My guest today is Erin Lewellen. She's the CEO of Tilting Futures, and her organization is helping young adults from over 100 countries lead with empathy, adaptability, and curiosity by dropping them into unfamiliar places and helping them get out of their comfort zone and learn and grow.
Our bigger goal is to create a global coalition of young people with the skills and networks needed to solve our greatest and most complex global challenges.
In our conversation today, I'm going to ask Erin to share her thoughts on why leadership starts with knowing yourself first, how Erin builds a culture where hard conversations aren't avoided, they're expected, respected, and drive better decisions, what Tilting Futures teaches young leaders about system thinking and empathy, how to hire for curiosity, not just competence, and the 2 questions Erin asks herself every week. Tilting Futures teaches young leaders from over 100 countries how to lead with empathy and self-awareness. But really, my question for you is, can you actually teach self-awareness, or is it something you're either born with or not?
You can absolutely teach self-awareness. It's a muscle, in my opinion. We develop it through deliberate practice. And I want to be clear, I don't think developing self-awareness is particularly fun. It requires us to have the courage to look for honest feedback, to sit in that moment of discomfort when the truth comes, and to be vulnerable enough to change course when needed. So I think it absolutely can be learned, and it requires a strength, an inner strength that is also a muscle to be developed.
So if you're a leader and you have somebody on your team, or maybe even a mentor, and you can see somebody who struggles with self-awareness, what is one tip or piece of advice you have for them to help that person become better at developing it?
That's a great question. I would answer it in 2 ways. First, I would say, I think it's important you start developing this muscle at a young age. So that's one, so that when you get into a position of leadership, you've already got some habits underway that help you continue to build your self-awareness, because this is a lifelong pursuit. And then the second thing I would say is, I've got a couple questions that I always ask myself, and I will say they came from my dear mom, who would consistently say, well, Erin, when I was a kid and having trouble with friends, who's the common denominator in this situation? Or, don't you think we should take a look in the mirror first before we think about that being someone else's fault? And so these 2 questions, I always literally ask myself at least weekly. Well, let me look in the mirror. What have I done to participate in this challenge? Or, I'm having some challenges in 4 different areas. That would make me the common denominator here. So those are just some little clues that I use as a leader consistently.
I really like the one about asking yourself, maybe I should look in the mirror, because there's so many times where you get in a situation and your first instinct maybe is to blame somebody else, and maybe take a step back and think, let me think about what could I have done differently in this situation, and think about it before you move forward and pass blame. So I think that's a great tip right there. Okay, let's get into young leaders. Tell us a little bit more about Tilting Futures. How did it come to be, and what is really the mission when it comes to working with these young people?
So we're entering our 15th year of existence, and our bigger goal is to create a global coalition of young people with the skills and networks needed to solve our greatest and most complex global challenges. So you can imagine this is going to require a lot of those foundational skills that start with self-awareness. The way we do this is we recruit young people from all over the world, and we bring them together in a context other than their own. So right now we operate in Cape Town, South Africa. We operate in Georgetown, Malaysia. Imagine a cohort of about 50 to 75 kids. In that cohort, they'll be from about 40 to 50 different countries. And they have an apprenticeship. So they're getting real world skills in a global issue. So think human rights, think environment and sustainability, complex problems that transcend borders and will require global cooperation for us to navigate. So they have this apprenticeship, and then we have a curriculum that rolls through it to really maximize the learning and ensure that when they leave, they've grown in two really distinct areas: self-discovery, self-awareness, and global orientation. And the combination of those two together is what creates the transformational moment for a young person to think differently about themselves, about the responsibility to this world we're in, responsibility to a greater community, and where they want to take their skills and talents next.
And the ages you really focus on are between 17 and 22, right?
Yep.
And so let's talk a little bit about why you've targeted that age group.
So right now they're old enough to have some independent thinking, but they're young enough to not have formed any idea of who they are as a person. So in that moment of developmental stage, what we can do is really give them an experience that allows them to interrogate themselves, interrogate some of their own belief systems, get some input from peers, get some input from the organizations and impact leaders that they're working with, and then begin to formulate a way of being in the world that is consistently building self-awareness, consistently building leadership, not sort of thinking about it as a place to arrive and then get stagnant, but rather, I have a way of being in the world that can work with people who are very different than me, that can think of compromises or solutions that will serve two distinct needs rather than just my need. That's a way of being in the world. And if you can tip that thinking at an early age, the impact actually ends up being quite large across their lifetimes. And so that's why we focus right there.
And now more than ever, it's super important. I mean, look at the world we live in, how polarized everything it is, right? So is your hopes that by getting these young adults at an early age through this program, that they will come out the other end with a different view than how things are now and less polarized?
Absolutely. That's a huge piece of what we do. And we have a research team at UC Berkeley and a research team at Harvard that help us understand the impact of our work. And one of the big pieces that we found is that our young people feel a sense of belonging to their global community. And then when you break that down, what it means is that when you're feeling a sense of community among people from really different backgrounds, you're able to think about their perspective in a different way. Where's this perspective coming from? And why do I have a different perspective? Rather than, oh, that perspective is wrong. And that's a different approach to being in a community. And I think that is a big piece of how we can navigate some of this divisiveness that we're seeing right now. You got to get into the world. You got to have experiences that make you realize what you thought before isn't quite true or isn't quite the whole story. Those are the types of experiences that a young person needs to have. So when they enter a situation where they're seeing something that doesn't quite resonate with them, it's not an automatic push away. It's actually like, let me get a little closer to this to understand that perspective. That's a different approach and one we could desperately use right now.
Absolutely. And look at your background. We joked about this beforehand. You got all kinds of books back there. I got all kinds of books here myself. And yes, reading books is great for learning, but also what's great for learning is travel. And I'm not just talking about, going on a, trip to Paris for a week or so, but traveling and living in these different locations, whether it's Cape Town or anywhere. So share a little bit of why travel can have such a huge impact on learning.
You're completely right. It's a type of traveling that we think is important. So when we think about where transformational learning can really happen, and what I mean by that is You have a fundamentally different perspective when you come out than when you came in on both yourself and something in the world. That happens when you're outside of your comfort zone. And so travel is a very natural place for that to happen. You can go into a different environment and suddenly your ideas about how you solve a challenge, how you create dialogue, how you eat, all the ways that people do things differently. When you're in a new environment, all of your senses are so alive. And I think that is required for the deeper learning. I can sit in a classroom, I can feel very comfortable. I can feel a little less comfortable if I know the professor might call on me at any moment. That might make me feel a little less comfortable, but I'm still in a familiar place. I know where the bathroom is. I know how to speak the language. I can kind of predict what's going to happen in this setting. When you're in a different environment, all of those things are up in the air, and it forces an awareness that's very heightened. And I think that opens your learning up in ways that just don't happen in a traditional classroom.
You just can't fake it anymore.
Yeah, you can't. Exactly.
You're in the middle of it where you could be sitting in a classroom and you could be zoning out, and you know that, hey, I'm good at memorizing facts or information and passing a test. But when you're in another country and you're in a Uber or a cab or ordering at a restaurant, and maybe you don't speak the same language, so sure, it builds self-awareness. I also like to think it builds a tremendous amount of adaptability, which is so important these days.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I think about some of the lessons I've learned from traveling personally. And one of them is I know you know this about me, but I'm from a blue collar family. So I have this incredible family, and my dad was very insistent that as a young woman, I speak my mind, I raise my hand, I am engaging, I like building this confidence in me, right? To stand up for myself and go after what I wanted, which I have been appreciative of my whole life. I go to Cape Town, I have an internship, I'm 22, and I have this mindset. And I'm in this, it's a meeting of women around I got this incredible opportunity to go to this meeting where women were talking about some of the challenges in Cape Town and facing women specifically. And I started speaking in this meeting as if I had any authority, my 22-year-old self, right? And it was such a good learning opportunity. It was deeply embarrassing and humbling, as you can imagine, to have someone turn to me and say, hold on. First off, who are you? And in this space, you should probably listen first. Kind, but clear. And I had this moment where I was like, right, context matters. And in my former context, that made a lot of sense. I was working, my summer job was at a lumber mill. Yeah, speak my mind, go after things. That's a very different context than being in a meeting of women leaders in Cape Town, where my job was to learn and listen and be grateful for being in the space. And it was just this moment. It feels very small, but it forever impacted how I enter a space from here on out.
That's a great story.
Thank you.
What were you going to say? I didn't mean to cut you off.
I was going to say, and it affects me right now. I don't speak first in a meeting. I don't ever. I'm the CEO. Always listen. People ask a question. I'm not going to be the first to answer it. I'm not going to not participate as the CEO, because that doesn't work either. But I would much rather be second, third, fourth in the conversation, because it allows for opinions to be put at the table in a different way. So it's still alive today.
There's two things there. So first, I give a lot of credit to the person who turned to you and said that, because that could be uncomfortable as well, right? I mean, that's a little bit of a difficult conversation. And so I think that when we're in a situation like that, whether it's as a mentor or maybe even just sitting in the same room with somebody, having, getting out and saying that, what a difference that makes. Because she could have just sat there, but she basically changed your life or helped frame how you want to look at things. which I think is so cool. And the second thing that I think you bring up is really cool for all the leaders and CEOs out there listening. Let your team go first. When we have a meeting, I'm the same way. I don't want to jump in with ideas right off the bat, because then the tendency might be like, let's agree with what Damon has to say. So it's always better to kind of hold your tongue and kind of sit back and see what happens and transpires, and then add in your ideas. So those are two great points right there.
Thank you. I completely agree that your team has way more answers than you do. Well, and I'll speak for myself, than I do. My team has many more answers than I do. And if I go first, I just leave a bunch of the best ideas on the table, or not on the table. They don't even make it to the table.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you do that too often, or you jump in too often, your team's not going to even come up with ideas anymore, because they're going to know they're not going to be heard. But
Right.
I want to get back to, okay, so these students, they leave this experience, they're there for, I think, what, 6 months?
4 months.
Oh, 4
Mm-hmm.
months.
Mm-hmm.
What are some of the immediate shifts that you tend to see in the student's mindset or behavior?
Well, I think so. If I come back a little bit, one of our goals, the reason that we have built this concept, this framework, this model of Take Action Lab, and paired up with 2 research teams at UC Berkeley and Harvard, the reason we've done that is because we are trying to prove the efficacy of this type of learning. And the reason we want to prove that is because the bolder idea is, how does higher ed integrate this truly into a degree seeking pathway, rather than a nice to have, if you can get a summer internship, great, go for it. Sure, we'll give you a few credits for that experience you had, but there's really very limited. There are some great examples, but there are limited examples for where it's truly integrated. You will do something akin to a Take Action Lab in your pathway to that degree in environmental studies or that engineering degree. And we're trying to shift that. And so that's why we measure what our impact is, and what we see is exactly what we would hope. So we see improvement in a young person understanding with more clarity as they pursue their higher education purpose. And a sense of agency, so they can navigate both, first, the world of the university, but also navigate career. They have this way of taking initiative in a different, fundamentally new way. And then the other pieces and I think those are just skills that help them navigate that world, right? Both of those worlds. But then the other pieces that I think are even, more community minded is this greater sense of self-awareness being needed in the context with whatever they're doing. So a lot of these young people are going to go on to be leaders, and they're going to lead either initiatives or they're going to lead organizations. And for them to have a practice of self-reflection, a practice of asking themselves, well, what role do I want to play, and what role am I playing, and how are those two different, is critical to building a leadership pipeline that has empathy, that can work with people, that can bring a team along. Those are critical. And then I think the other piece that we see is, one of the things that's really interesting, we did a control group analysis, and we learned a ton of things through doing that about the impact of our programming. But one of them that I think is so critical is reduced prejudicial attitudes. And this, for me, is, if you're going to be a young leader, being able to not make assumptions about someone who's sitting across the table from you before they've even spoken is critical. Being able to be more curious rather than judging what an idea and where that idea is coming from and who has this idea is critical for finding the best idea. So these are some of the pieces that we find our research shows that lead a young person to navigate differently. And then they go on to, all kinds of jobs. We've got young people working cross sector. So they're working in the private sector, they're working in nonprofit, they're working in government, but they're taking this approach with them, which is, I think, going to make us all better once they rise into positions of leadership.
let's go back a second to them being less prejudice, so to speak.
Yeah.
Do you believe this is happening because their opportunity, because they're living in a different country, a different, continent, and they have so many different connections of people from all around that they're seeing and experiencing things from a different point of view?
Yes, I do. And I was actually, this may sound strange, but I was surprised by this coming out because this came from a control group analysis of young people who had applied for our programming, so they were inclined to want something like this. They had gotten accepted but waitlisted. And so they were young people with, I would think, a mindset that you could say, oh, well, they're already kind of in this, they're going to think this way. They're going to be open-minded. But when we took that group and we measured them against the group that went through the programming, going through the programming produced reduced prejudicial attitudes. And I think it's a few different things. I think once you've been in a situation where you had a perspective and you develop a cohort of people from very different backgrounds across the world that challenge that perspective, you begin to realize and recognize that your own perspective is literally just that. It is a perspective that can be changed, shifted, challenged appropriately, and it makes you think differently about other people's perspectives. And I think if we think about even in our own country, in the United States, I mean, if we could get the right and the left to stop having these prejudices against each other, we would be in a totally different situation where we could listen to each other and understand where's our common ground. It would make a lot of difference, I think.
Absolutely. I mean, not to get political, but yeah, but if each side could just be curious
Yeah.
and even for a second, Erin, say, let's just look at this from their perspective and see if there's any truth to it, and just look at it from different angles. I think we could get along a lot better. And that's why I think what you're doing at Tilting Futures is amazing. And it also helps you with problem solving, right? Even just understanding and uncovering what problems are.
Yes. Yeah, I think it helps you get to the root of a problem. And I think that's a big piece of what we do. So part of our curriculum is this self-awareness and global orientation. And that's where we spent a lot of this conversation. But there are two other really key pieces to a Take Action Lab that a young person walks away with. And one of them is, and this is with the curriculum, obviously the experience gives them a lot of richness, but the curriculum teaches systems thinking. And the reason is we're always working at these two levels. So a young person has an individual experience with a social impact leader. Say they're working at a food bank, for example, and they're working with that social impact leader on developing some fundraising campaigns for their food bank. I'm just making this up. That is a real thing that someone is doing right now. But so let's say that. But what we don't want is them to leave this experience thinking only about that food bank and not thinking about the systems with which created the need for a food bank and what levers at the system level would need to be pulled to make sure that food insecurity went away. Because we want a person to be thinking on two levels. And the second thing we teach is asset-based solution seeking. So this is critical because if we approach challenges from a different understanding, if we approach challenges by saying, okay, this community has so many strengths and there's this challenge. What strengths in our community can we bring to bear to meet this challenge? That is a fundamentally different place to come from rather than this idea of, oh, there's so many deficits in this community. It's got so many challenges. Where do I even start? Right? There's some nihilism that can come in there, right? Why would I even pursue this at all? Instead, flipping that frame for a young person at an early age helps them navigate challenges from a strengths-based perspective for themselves and for the greater community. And so it's always like that self-community, because we don't exist on our own.
Yeah. And it can be overwhelming, especially if there's so many things that look like they're not going well, right? Or just too hard to fix. If you could focus on some of the strengths and like you said, flip the script, I mean, I think it works well for both, like you said, self and community. So, and by the way, I love take action labs. I wish I could have come up with that myself for Learn It. I mean, it's just great. And, but so obviously there's a huge impact for your students and your learners. But in order for all of this to go really well, you have to have a great team behind the scenes internally at Tilting Futures. So let's talk a little bit about your culture and your organization, starting with the onboarding process.
I think culture is critical in any team environment. Also with my wife coached high school basketball for 20 years. So the culture of your team, I am a team culture type of person. And luckily so is the entire team at Tilting Futures. But we cultivate this. And I think I'll start maybe controversially with where I think a lot of leaders go wrong on this, which is let me go into my office or my little area and let me draw up what our culture will be. Let me just write this out and then here it is, deliver it. This is our culture. And everyone's looking at each other thinking, that's not our culture. That's not my experience of our culture. I didn't participate in building that. And there's this idea of it should be aspirational and therefore also often divorced from reality. So at Tilting Futures, we do things a little bit differently. We talk about our culture, we talk about our values and what we're trying to do as we work together within the context of those values. And so then that sounds lofty. Then it gets into working agreements. It gets into how do we work together? And then you back that up into, okay, you've got a new teammate. How do you onboard this person to make sure they're maximally successful? So of course we onboard them with walking them through our values and how they get played out and what our expectations are, walking them through our working agreements. But then there's also a meeting that I have with every new employee. And this is, I think, a really great opportunity for them to get some time to talk with me, to share, to learn from each other. I get to learn about them. They get to learn about me. But it's this fundamental, what my whole session is on. I've seen a lot of folks at Tilting Futures be really successful. And what do they have in common? And then that's what I walk them through. And we get to have a conversation about what that means. What things do all these employees have in common? So I'm happy to walk you through those if you want me to.
Well, that was my question. So you referred to it when we spoke before about what made them wildly successful. So what are the traits that make employees at Tilting Futures wildly successful?
Okay, sorry, then I should have led with that. Okay, so here's my session. We talk about, the first one is there is no they, there is only we. And this principle, I think, is critical because I think one of the things that I mean, we've all been in organizations where the culture is off, or we have a great culture and then it gets a little sideways and you got to kind of bring it back. And I think what a lot of times will happen is, if they would just stop doing this, or they decided we should do this, there's this dynamic of two teams, and they is almost always some sort of mythical entity when you really get into it. So if everyone is participating and there is we as the grounding force, then when you feel like maybe the morale isn't that great, it's not because of something they did. You're saying, okay, well, we've gotten ourselves to a point where our morale is a little low. How can I participate in helping fix this? That's a shift, right? Rather than blame, it's you're a part of this. It's about self-awareness, about looking in the mirror. It's the same things we've been talking about, but this is a key tenet. There's no they, only we. The second one is we lead with curiosity and relentlessly search for better. So we're looking for teammates who are always wanting it to be better. They want our impact to be better. They want our admissions to be better. They want our culture to be better. And they're leading with curiosity around how can that happen? And
let's talk about that one for a second.
Great.
because I love the lead with curiosity and always looking to get better. And I just wrote that down. What does that look like in interview process? How do you identify individuals who could fall into that type of mindset?
So we believe in, I'm going to get technical, in a competency-based approach for interviewing. And this is something that I have always thought. I'm not a fan of hypotheticals because you can just make up an answer and they all end up sounding the exact same, in my opinion. So give me an example when you finished a project and you were thinking about how you could have done it better. Tell me, what did you do and how would you have made it better the next time? So you're just trying to get at, do they look for self-improvement? Are they self-reflective? How would they characterize it? And you can tell if someone does not have an answer to that, then that they don't reflect after their projects. That's problematic. Or you say, tell me about a time when you had a project that was wildly successful. Da, 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 da. What went wrong in that process where you had to course correct, where something was not right and you had to fix something? That's illuminating, because basically everyone who's ever done a project has had something go wrong that they've had to pause, recalibrate, and move forward. And if they can't find something, then you can really understand that they're not reflecting throughout the process. They're not thinking critically about their own pathway. So those are some of the ways we get at it. We're looking for continuous learning. We're looking for consistently measuring their own performance, trying to be as objective as possible in that. And then we're looking for someone who finishes something and then very next time they do that, they already know how they're going to do it better the next time.
I agree with you when you say that you don't like hypotheticals, but where I disagree is on the spot. I think it's hard to make up a story like that. And I think it's so important to, in the interview process, to connect them with stories or have them tell stories. Because what I like to look for as well, Erin, is when something goes wrong, where's the blame falling? Is it because of the manager? Is it because somebody else did something? Or are they taking accountability and ownership themselves and saying, well, here's something I could have done differently, which I think is great to have that type of vulnerability, especially in an interview, because you might be worried of the other person on the other side saying, well, I don't want to hire them because they're admitting mistakes.
I don't think we're disagreeing at all. I think, there's a whole sort of ethos around interviewing and making the person feel comfortable and making sure that it's a conversation and putting our culture and values in the middle of that interview, right? So I'm going to show curiosity too. I'm going to probe to make sure I'm understanding. But what I am looking for is the ability to self-reflect, the ability to have ask those deeper questions about, there could be another way to do this. And after I finished it, or once I reached this obstacle, I was able to find that better path. And I think those stories are hard to come up with, which is why I always say, take a second, just think about an accomplishment that we can kind of dig in together, because I'm going to ask you lots of questions about it, and give them a time. I don't expect them to have it perfect out of the gates, but I do think I'm looking for the exact same things that you're looking for.
Great. And what we're talking about here are these soft skills, which I hate that term soft skills because they're not soft skills. You wrote a great article in Forbes that I'll place in the show notes. And these are also skills that won't be replaced by AI. I think that they'll be supplemental. And it's so important. We've talked about adaptability, critical thinking, problem solving, curiosity, all working together. Those are fantastic. The other thing that I really appreciate that you and I spoke about before, I want to get into, one of the working agreements is being able to say, I disagree, and have these conflict type conversations. Share a little bit more about that.
That is one of our core working agreements. For us, disagreement is a normal part of finding solutions to problems, and we encourage disagreement. So if there is no disagreement in any of the things that you're discussing, you inevitably are not going to come up with the best idea. And so one of the big pieces for our senior leadership team is we're much more interested in the best path, the best idea, rather than our own self-interest that we had the best idea. And when you have that orientation, then that allows for disagreement, and it encourages disagreement because it makes the idea stronger. And so another place where we have an agreement that helps facilitate this is if we are having a feeling and we have the capacity, we name that feeling. This may sound touchy-feely, but here's how it translates. If I'm saying something and someone's feeling like I'm not saying my full opinion, let's say, someone could say, I'm just having this feeling that we're not getting the full story of how you feel about this. And this happened to me just the other day. And you know what? These things are important for creating a culture, but they make you feel uncomfortable. So they're not always like, it's not la la land. It's actually, disagreement is hard, and disagreeing well with respect and civility takes practice. And having someone say, I feel like you're not really telling us the whole, like your whole sort of perspective on this, like you're holding back, forced me to say, yeah, okay, so here's how I'm feeling about this. And we had to kind of take a step back and recognize that my line of questioning did have reasons behind it that I wasn't being explicit about, and I needed to be called out on that. And then we had a much better conversation after someone had the courage, which is one of our values, to step forward. And there's language behind it. We say, you know, we've got these working agreements. So the person got to say, I'm going to live into one of our working agreements and say, I feel like I'm not getting the full story of how you're feeling about this. And then boom, it led to a much better outcome.
So I'm in agreement with you on that. But what do you say to the leaders who will say, well, feedback should always be done in private. You shouldn't be having this kind of conversation in front of other people?
One of my key pieces as CEO is to always try to make the implicit explicit. And it creates the context that we all need to be able to make good decisions. So if the team is guessing how you feel or how you think, and you're not being explicit, then you're shortchanging their ability to lead well. And I think that's what I would say to that. Now, if someone wants to talk to me about something deeper that they're worried about with my leadership, or I'm not looking for some sort of call out culture where we're just calling each other out and it's ruthless in its, way of being. It's much more about how can we get to the best outcome. And if I need to name a feeling that is happening here for me that I think is maybe impacting the group or whatever, I'm going to name it so that we can get through it and move to the solution. That's different than if someone's just, I've noticed a pattern with something that's happening with you, Erin, lately, and I want to talk to you about it. Sure, take me aside, have a conversation with me about it. And then we can move from there. It's not about blasting someone. It's about getting to the best outcome. And I think it takes practice. This is not an easy, you don't just jump into this. We've been practicing it for over a year now, and it's made a huge difference in levels of trust among us.
Well, I think the key word you said right there is trust. I think in order to have this type of culture and these types of conversations, it has to start with trust, where everybody knows that they respect each other and that you all have a common goal of, well, whatever your common goal is, your North Star that you have at Tilting Futures or you have at Learn It, to be able to have those kind of conversations, and you want to do it with respect. And what I hear you saying is that you also want to get to a decision or whatever it is quicker by not having, when you're sitting in a Teams meeting or a Zoom meeting and people are IMing each other on the side saying, I wish we could just say that, knock that and the water cooler stuff off and just bring that to the forefront instead of having it happen after, the meeting that happens after the meeting.
Oh yeah. I am very much not a fan of the meeting that happens after the meeting. And in fact, even with our board of directors, we had this wonderful moment where we decided to bring our working agreements and our values to our board of directors and have a conversation about it. Because what we wanted to do, this a few years ago, was shift into a new dynamic where we're one team and we're having a conversation that is with that feels together towards solving some of these challenges so that we can have the greatest impact in the world. The reason someone joins a board is because they're excited about your mission and they want to help you move it forward. So how do we recognize that building a team requires investment? It doesn't just happen. And for us, it was about 3 years ago, we recognized, hey, we've got this. We're building this amazing rapport and way of working together on the senior leadership team. Let's just make that explicit to the board and say, this is the type of working relationship we want with you. Game changer. I mean, we really feel like one team, and the senior leadership team and the board are very fluid, working together, supporting each other, naming some of the hard truths where if we don't feel like a strategy is tight enough, if we don't feel like that idea for a donor is good enough, I mean, we speak these truths to each other so that we get better. And it's made a huge difference.
So I'm thinking about, again, the Take Action Labs and, in the curriculum that you use for your students. Is there anything that's come up from what you learned from the students that you've then imported into your existing team?
It's a really good question. I mean, I would say it is a consistent conversation that what we are teaching, we need to also learn.
That's a big one.
So it really is, it's very alive. And there was a moment, we've been around about 15 years, and I came on around 12 years ago. So there was a moment there where we had a set of values that had been drafted up and put on a pretty webpage. And then we had our behaviors and values for our students, and they were different. And I remember saying, wait, hold on. Shouldn't we have a set of these that if you are a student graduating from a Tilting Futures program, or you are an employee who worked here for 5 years and then went on to do something different, you could recite these and they would be the same. And it was this moment where everybody was like, yes, these should all be aligned. And so that's a big piece of us. Like, there's nothing separate around what we're teaching for our students that we are not trying to live and model every day. And it's hard work. What we're asking them to do is hard. Being vulnerable is not easy, but it facilitates richness that is worth it. And I think that's what we're trying to teach young people, and we're trying to teach ourselves as we move in the world.
Well, what I hear you saying, and I agree, first of all, learning is hard. That's why a lot of people don't continue to do it, because it takes consistency and it takes work. The other thing I hear you saying, which is exactly what I believe in at Learn It, is we're out teaching all these leaders and these, people B2B. Well, you can't just say one thing and then do another. So that's why I'm always trying to invest in our own team to continue learning and model it myself, continuing to learn and grow and get better, because how are we going to be passionate about it and help others if we're not doing it ourselves? So I think that that's really important.
I completely agree with that. And the only way you can, it gets back to the very beginning of this conversation. Self-awareness and building self-awareness is a muscle. Building a collaborative culture that produces excellent results is a muscle. And if you're not exercising it and working on it every day, it will atrophy, just like a muscle will. So I think there's something there that the consistency, we review our working agreements, and a team member leads this process every meeting that we get together, and says something like, what's one way a team member of yours modeled one of our working agreements? Give them a shout out. What's one working agreement for this particular conversation that we're about to have that you're going to need to really be aware of for yourself? All these different questions that we're interacting with our working agreements every single staff meeting that we have, that makes a huge difference in exercising that muscle.
How often, I was going to ask that question, how often does that take place where a team member leads that conversation?
So we have a weekly staff meeting that's an all hands meeting, and that happens every week. And then our senior leadership team meeting is also every week, and it happens at every senior leadership team meeting. It also happens at the team meetings level. So where there is a meeting of a group that's consistent, and even when it's ad hoc, we will start with our working agreements. It's 5 minutes. We get right down to business. We're quite efficient, but it sets the tone every single time.
No, I think that's great. And otherwise, the values or working agreements, they just get stuck on the wall or in a drawer. But if you're asking people to come and think about it and share it, that's how it keeps it alive. I think that's fantastic. We're almost at time here, but I wanted to ask, so you've been doing these for about 15 years, right? These not adventures, but these action labs for the students.
Mm-hmm.
How have the students changed over the years? Do you feel like that they're the same, or is there a noticeable difference maybe in their mindset that going into these action labs?
I think how I would answer this is their context has changed dramatically in 15 years. So in 15 years, if we think about what I mean by context, A, the phone, the smartphone, social media, right? So they are in a relationship with social media in ways that 15 years ago, young people weren't. Whether they're trying to not be on it all the time, whether they're trying to engage responsibly, that all, is individual by individual. But the fact that they're contending with that is very dramatically different. The other context is that they're living in a much more polarized context right now, a much more polarized environment than 15 years ago. And so they're being asked to participate in that polarization and divisiveness in lots of different ways that they might feel uncomfortable with, but don't have yet words or ways of navigating that feel right to them. And so the things they're being asked to navigate and contend with right now are radically different. And every generation contends with complexity. This generation is contending with complexity, I think, at new levels as we introduce AI, as we introduce social media, connectedness that is not actual connection through digital channels, digital channels. I think there's a lot of things that we're asking of them that were not asked of, certainly of me, but even the young people we were working with in the first year or two, that we just have to be really mindful about as educators and as adults who are ahead of them in their journey, that this kind of context really matters for how they're being asked to navigate.
No, that's so important. And I was just thinking about, I got a 3-year-old and a 7-year-old, and what's that going to look like in 10 years from now? And what does the world that they're going to have to navigate look like? Tilting futures. What's one moment from a student or a team member where you reflect back and say, this is exactly why I'm doing this work?
There are so many moments. I think of a young woman who came into the program. She's a scientist. She's from a Shona village in Zimbabwe. And she came in very focused on biomedical engineering. This is her passion, and her passion is really born from something very near and dear to her heart. How do you think about disease and disease eradication as it impacts different populations disproportionately? So it was really all science-based. It was just very technical. And what she speaks about coming out of a Take Action Lab is that, hold on, yes, all of these medical advances are important and I'm going to participate in that. But I'm never going to lose sight of how is this not just a narrow science focus, but how do I also learn around how do you bring people along in the science? How do you create awareness around the things that might, could be like prevention or community-based public health practices? How do I not get very siloed in my thinking, which in her mind, she was when she came in, but because she started thinking about systems and because people interrogated some of her ways of thinking, she's thinking much more broadly around what's possible as we think about health, healthcare, disease. It's the science is critical, but if you don't take into community adoption and you don't take into a fact that like some communities are going to get the cures for this and some communities are not, and how do we design something that can go global, those types of approaches really change the way a young person thinks and then what they ultimately pursue. And that's just one example of a young person having their perspective broadened. And she's just been named to a couple UN councils, and she's this dynamic young woman. And the experience with a global group of peers, getting outside of her comfort zone, made her think dramatically different, but also, it just supercharged her passion and power in a different way.
So how does that make you feel as a CEO, knowing that you help contribute to an individual's life like that?
That's why I get up every single day. Every day, this is what we work on. How do you get more young people to have experiences that take their kernels of ideas and really help them put those into practice and make a big impact in the world? That's what we do. That's what we try to do every day. And that's what we're working on expanding every day.
Well, this has been wonderful, Erin. Is there anything else you want to leave us with?
I guess I would say we've talked a lot about self-awareness, and I can't really emphasize enough the importance of looking in the mirror. And I think I would just say, I ask myself that consistently. And I do think, Damon, you were so right that our instinct sometimes is to want to say, oh, if only this person would do something different, then everything would be better. But really, it's us that need to do something different to enact that change. And I think that it all starts there.
To recap what we talked about tilting futures and your mission there, the experience that the students from over 100 countries receive and how it's designed, the takeaways and the ROI from the programs, not just short-term, but long-term, and on your website, all the stats that are about that. Then we moved into your team internally that's delivering and the working agreements. I really like the curiosity and how could we always get better? And of course, discomfort and conversations and labeling those. And so many, I mean, Erin, this has been one of my favorite conversations. I mean that. And so thank you very much. As for Tilting Futures, as far as applying, I saw something that like 17,000 people applied at one time. And I assume as well, maybe you could share this a little bit, that there are scholarships available for individuals who maybe can't afford the tuition.
Absolutely. So a big piece of my role is to raise the philanthropic revenue to be able to support young people from all over the world and from all different backgrounds to have an experience like this. And so if you're a young person or you're a parent of a young person and you want them to have a Tilting Futures experience, our website is tiltingfutures.org. Take a look at it. And when you apply, the process is you apply. When you're admitted, then you go through a financial aid process, and we have a need-based system, much like a college or a university. And this is also why we are trying to embed ourselves into higher ed, because the idea is that you shouldn't have to go find a program and apply. It should just be part of your degree. And that's the next step.
And where else can people connect with you at? I assume LinkedIn?
Oh, absolutely. Please connect with me on LinkedIn. And you can connect with us on LinkedIn. You can also connect with us on, the usual Instagram, Facebook, those types of things too.
All right, Erin, this has been awesome. And for our listeners out there, do me a favor. I want you to think about, well, maybe it's yourself, but I want you to think about other parents and young adults who could benefit from Tilting Futures experience and send this episode to them. Or if you know individuals who might want to contribute and donate to the cause and help other maybe underprivileged kids experience this, because at the end of the day, if we can build future generations of better leaders, it's going to benefit all of us. So until next time, everybody, stay curious, keep learning, and have a great day. Thank you.